I don't like the term end of empire because I would like to think that as much as we have behaved in an imperial fashion at times, that we aspire to something better, just as
Better than
there's,
empire.
yeah,
Hmm.
just as there is obviously a lot of racism in the history of the country, including its founding, but we aspire to something better.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the end of whatever it is, the end of republic, right, that we may be seeing is, I would argue, the result of this process, which, at one point, one of the people I've become friends with from my Patreon discussions posed the question, is there an analogy to senescence, that is the process of growing feeble and inefficient with age that happens to bodies? Is there an analogy for civilization? And what I told him, and I think I did a little video on it, was that it was more than an analogy, that there was in fact the exact same process. And my argument was, for reasons I won't go into here, the reason that we grow feeble and inefficient with age is that we are complex creatures with a relatively small instruction set. That means that instruction set contains instructions that do many things. One instruction does many things. And when that's true, there will be things that are good for you early in life, and they're bad for you late in life, and they will get collected by selection. They will be favored because it's very likely that you will get the benefit of the early stuff and you won't live long enough to suffer from the late stuff. And even if you do, most of your reproduction will be done anyway, so it counts less. So selection is constantly accumulating things that are good for us early and bad for us late. Now, here's the problem. Our political and economic system does the same goddamn thing, right? If you come up with some new process, right? Social media or internal combustion engines, and it empowers your society.
Haber-Bosch process.
Right, Haber-Bosch process, right. Suddenly, boom, everything's great. We can do stuff we couldn't do before. We can grow crops on soil we couldn't grow them on before. We can go places faster without breathing hard. All this good stuff emerges from it, right? And then the point is, okay, later on, the costs of these things done at some scale that the people who invented them could not have imagined become evident, and you can't do anything about them. Why? Because once they have become so ungodly profitable, you can't tell them no. You can't turn them off.
And at the beginning of anything, it would be taken as such extraordinary arrogance to imagine that it would become a world-dominating force. The Haber-Bosch process, which allowed for the fixation of nitrogen into synthetically produced fertilizers and thus expanded agriculture orders of magnitude more than it had been possible. The originator of the internal combustion engine, the originator of social media, and those last two cases, there's more than two people. But whatever those early people were, if they had started thinking about, well, what do we have to put into place to make sure that this doesn't force the end of the world, right? Like, what do we have to put in place to make sure that there will be controls on it so that the naturally evolving processes don't actually take over? Most of the people in their startup, or whatever the equivalent of the startup would have been back at the, early 20th century, would have laughed at them. You can't spend time there. You can't spend your resources there. We're trying to make a go of it. We're trying to get this amazing new technology out there into the world. You don't think about putting the brakes on it before it even has momentum.
No, and in fact, this is what the right fears about the left is at the point that you make an internal combustion engine and you've come up with something, crude oil literally used to sit as a nuisance on the surface of the earth. Right? It was a problem sludge.
You grew up near one of these problem sludges in the
did.
tar pits in La Brea in LA.
But it used to be much more widespread than that. The idea that you could fractionate that material and use it to transport goods arbitrarily long distances.
It's unimaginable.
It's unimaginably awesome. And the idea of the buzzkill that's wagging their finger at such a process and saying, don't you realize you could screw up the atmosphere with that? It's like, how much of this would you have to do before you even affected the atmosphere? And it's like, well, ultimately you'll get there.
Yeah.
Right. So that very thing, the fact that you need a process that allows people to discover shit without people wagging their fingers at them and saying, you never know what the downstream consequences are going to be, right? That voice has to shut up. But there has to be some process that recognizes, you know what? You do enough of that, you will alter something that matters. And we have to be able to say no to you at that point, even after you've become a tycoon. Right.
Yes.
So,
especially at that point.
Right. We have to be able to say no.
We have to be able to say no to you more so the more power you have. And yet it's also true that some things that you set in motion are incredibly difficult to unset. in motion.
Right. And how you even do it. I mean, the social media one, right? At the point that somebody figures out how to connect a group of people who are interested in, making models of famous battles, right? If you're making miniature models of famous battles and you're gathering on the internet to talk to other people who are hundreds of thousands of miles from you, right? And somebody's looking at that thinking, this process, it could get away from us. It could derange us. We could stop being able to think collectively about how to behave as a society. That sounds nuts, right? But lo and behold, you start dealing with, machine learning and search and feed algorithms and filter bubbles and all of this. And next thing you know, there's like an honest debate about whether 2 + 2 actually equals 4.
It's
right?
not honest.
Well,
it's a debate, but it's not honest.
Let's put it this way. Maybe that's even worse.
Yes.
Whatever debate it is that can catch fire, that has us debating this, that has us, looking at the question of whether or not to, eliminate the police because maybe that would be better.
Yeah.
All of these things are nuts. So my point would be the senescence of civilization would sound exactly like this. Basically, here's the point. What does senescence sound like in a person? It very often sounds like dementia. That's what happens when a brain is suffering all the downstream consequences of whatever made it vibrant as in youth, right? And this is like societal dementia. And it has exactly the nature that you're pointing to. You've got two groups. We agree on what the failure mode is, right? It's some kind of authoritarian evil that we don't want. And both groups think the other one is going to bring it.
Except that it's also true that some members of both groups only don't like authoritarian regimes when they're not in power.
Right.
And they won't say that out loud, but it's clearly true. And this is something that we've been saying since before Evergreen went public, but that the goal is not about reversing oppression. It's about turning the tables of oppression. And, that is just true. We've seen that over and over and over again, and it has no place in this moment in history, and yet it is claiming the throne at this moment in history.
Well, and I keep struggling for a better analogy than a ship, but it is as if we are on a ship on which our very survival depends. We're somehow in the middle of the Pacific. If the ship sinks, there's no one to come get us. It's just simply our ship. Two people, a Nazi and a Jew on the same ship in the middle of the Pacific ought to agree that the ship is actually top priority, right?
Yeah.
Because absent it, they're both doomed. So,
well, and so at one level, in terms of individuals making bad decisions right now, a lot of the people who are very, very confused are millennials who were parented really badly, not because their parents were mean or evil, but because they accepted a stupid parenting ideology of snowplowing and parenting and helicoptering all risk and challenge away from their children. At the same time that the elites in the West were grabbing more and more power for themselves. So now we arrive at today with a group of up-and-coming adults and adults who have rarely experienced real risk and challenge in their lives because just within their tiny family structure, they were protected from all of it if they were of a certain socioeconomic class, as many of the activists were. And simultaneously, there is an abdication of responsibility for the common good at the higher levels. And so we have these people on the streets now who are, fighting against the man or whatever they imagine it is, because someone has always been there to take care of their problems for them. Someone has always been there with the juice boxes, to get back to that. And in fact, the real power has walked away with their goodies and has left a vacuum at the top. And the parents who created them, in part, helped create the mess of a whole generation of kids who are now adults who don't know how to behave like adults because they never had challenge or risk as children, are breaking things in the streets because I imagine their sense is that things always get put right. There's no one around to put these things right. They are breaking things that cannot be put right, especially by their Nimrod parents who protected them from all risk in the first place.
Right. You're attacking the ship or whatever analog for it there is.
Yeah.
And the point is, look, kids, we may not be able to stop you from doing that, but do you know what happens if you succeed? Right? In attempting to stop you, we're actually, doing you a service because if you succeed, you'll doom us all.